The history books say that first contact between Europeans and native North Americans happened with Christopher Columbus in 1492. But what if they were wrong? What if that contact happened centuries earlier, here in the Canadian Arctic? Two groups from opposite sides of the world, laying eyes on each other for the first time.
Looks like it's been worse along here and here.
This Canadian archaeologist has found compelling new evidence of a building, a trading post, that was in use for centuries. Her discovery could change history.
Bit of wood. It's got a nice point to it.
The only time archaeologists can dig into the Arctic soil is during the short summer, when the tundra thaws.
I've been tormented to death by these blooming mosquitoes, man.
This team is braving the swarms of bugs because hidden in there is a story, told in a jumbled multitude of parts.
At the base here,
Yeah.
this is the first occupation level down here. It's got lashing holes. This piece has got lashing holes and the other one doesn't.
A piece of elm in an Arctic dig site.
Just so fragile.
Elm doesn't grow anywhere near the south coast of Baffin Island.
More cordage. Oh, yes. Look at it. There's quite a bit of it.
Other archaeological sites of this magnitude in the Canadian North were left behind by native people. But the evidence mounting here is leading to a radically different conclusion. The Norse were in North America centuries before the arrival of John Cabot or Christopher Columbus. By the year 1000, the Norse had ceased being Vikings, marauding bands of Vandals. They were now businessmen, and the North Atlantic was where they plied their trade. And they pushed their trading boundaries further and further west.
The overall picture of what we're getting here is that the Norse were here over a long period of time, and they had business to do. They were exploiting resources. That's why they were there. This is the beginning of globalization. This is the beginning of, global economy. They were going there so that they could push into new areas and exploit new resources. Behind all of it is trade, and that has not been emphasized in the past, particularly. I think North America has been seen as peripheral because of a different kind of approach to the questions than what's being taken now. All right, well, keep your eye peeled now for things that are not the little finished Dorset tools, but larger things.
Dr. Pat Sutherland has spent more than 3 decades of her professional life unraveling stories of the Arctic. Dr. Sutherland has been attempting to prove something nobody else has ever managed to do. Show that the Arctic was linked to an international trading network as early as 1,000 years ago. Dr. Sutherland started down this trail of inquiry back in the 1970s when she made a remarkable discovery up on Ellesmere Island.
The helicopter put us down and we looked around, and within about 5 minutes of landing, we picked this artifact up off the surface. And I have to admit that not knowing very much about the Norse at that time, I didn't know what it was.
It was new to her. She was searching for Arctic native sites, artifacts made of bone and antler.
If you think of scales of justice, it's broken, of course. There's another piece coming out here, like this one, with a finial and a hole. Then you have chains coming down and pans on either side, and then you'd have another part to the balance to hold it. Every Norse trader, professional trader, carried one of these balances. And in Scandinavia, they were used for weighing out silver, primarily.
A scale, a business tool that once belonged to a Norse trader. Pat Sutherland ruminated over that scale for years. How did it get there? Who did it belong to? What did it mean?
The balance shows the intent to trade, minimally the intent to trade. We had somebody on the Norse ship who was essentially a professional trader, and they went up there presumably with the intent to trade. Here's an assortment of tally sticks here. This one, you can see the notching on the surface here. So if I give you a whetstone and some metal, and you give me a walrus tusk, then we notch it off as one transaction. And this is a way of keeping record. And then it's split down the middle, and you take a record and I have a record. That's basically how they work.
She kept digging, literally, and the clues led her here, to this site on the south coast of Baffin Island. It's a site that had originally been unearthed in the 1960s.
The site was first discovered and investigated by an archaeologist from Michigan State University, Morrow Maxwell. He's passed on now, but he was here in the 60s and 70s working in this little valley. When he came, he was the first archaeologist in this area, so he would have done an overall survey of the islands, the Cape. He talked to people in the community. Where are there remains of old settlements? How long was it occupied? Who was here? What were they doing here? That's what we always do. Time and space. We look at time and space distributions. And he focused on this area because he was finding a lot of material. He said first and foremost it was a very complex site, possibly the most complex site in the Eastern Arctic. And he said it was Dorset.
To understand who the Dorset people were, you need to understand that there were different phases of human occupation in the Eastern Arctic. Today, there are the Inuit. They descended from another group called the Thule people, who migrated in from Alaska about 800 years ago. But before the Thule, it was the Dorset who ruled the Arctic for more than 3,000 years. Back in the 60s, Morrow Maxwell named the excavation site after a small carving he found of a bear. Nanook is Inuktitut for polar bear. He was searching for signs of the Dorset people, and there were some here at the Nanook site. But the Dorset artifacts were mixed in with a lot of others that didn't fit the pattern. In Maxwell's day, there wasn't even a hint in archaeological circles that anyone except the Dorset and the Thule could have been in the Canadian North so many centuries before Columbus. So in Maxwell's opinion, this site had to be Dorset, regardless of the incongruity in some of his finds. But when Pat Sutherland decided to take up the Nanook work where Maxwell left off, those incongruities piqued her interest.
When we got here, there was one stretch of wall, stone wall, that was exposed, and it was 2 courses high, and the rocks were extremely regular. It did not look like the wall of a Dorset structure.
There were several artifacts in the Nanook site record that seemed more Norse than Dorset. Pieces of exotic wood, bits of hand-spun cord, whetstones for sharpening metal knives, and tally sticks that were used to keep track of trade. With the Norse in mind, Dr. Sutherland took a step back and started to reconsider the area as a whole.
There's lots of sod here for building, and the Norse certainly used sod as insulation material and for wall building and roofing and so on in their structures. Also, it has a very nice little harbor, And the harbor is narrows and is quite sheltered on the inward portion of it, and it would be long enough to shelter a boat of the size that the Norse were sailing in. Those are two of the factors. The other thing I think might have been the resources that were available here. The Norse were certainly interested in furs, as well as other resources that this region would have to offer. Well, bag it as possible hide.
Dr. Sutherland had seen Dorset sites from Ellesmere Island down to Labrador. She was convinced Nanook wasn't Dorset.
I'll have to have the conservator clean it up when we get back.
The Dorset were highly mobile and lived in skin tents weighted down with a ring of stones. In the winter, they would dig in and make something more substantial. But not as substantial as this. The stone walls seem to mark out rooms. There is wood from Europe, small bits of tools the Dorset never had. To Dr. Sutherland, Maxwell's evidence was saying that this site was European. It wasn't that she was proving Morrow Maxwell wrong. In fact, he was one of Pat's mentors. Pat was building on Maxwell's work by considering the evidence she had at hand with a new mindset.
What have you got? Stone tool?
No, wood, I think.
Okay. And I mean, science is self-correcting. So, 20 years from now, some of the stuff that I've had to say may not hold water, but it's going after the new knowledge, I think. Oh, that's nice. It's ivory. Ivory? Yeah.
Going after new knowledge has been difficult, however. Morrow Maxwell overturned the layers of the Nanook site with his digging. Old Dorset items are now found closer to the surface than newer Norse artifacts.
Oh, nice bird bone there. It's a very complicated site. I gave a paper at a conference a few years back, and most people said that they wouldn't touch that site with a 10-foot pole because it's just so difficult. It's so challenging. There's sea mammal bone, and there's a chert flake. It's going to take quite some time yet to unravel the cultural sequence and the events of occupation and the architectural features too, because a lot of it was cut away in the 60s. So we're basically putting together small pieces of a very large puzzle.
The Norse sagas spoke about lands to the west of Greenland. One of them they called Helluland. Dr. Sutherland believes that Helluland was Baffin Island. Scottish archaeologist Dr. Mary MacLeod says that to understand how the Norse got to Helluland, it's important to look at the world in a different way. Not as pieces of land, but as highways of sea.
The world had a different shape then. It was linked by water rather than divided by water, and all these communities were tied together by this wonderful, this link of ships moving around the North Atlantic and moving through the river systems of Russia and the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. They were a very maritime people, and from around about 800 they were effectively island hopping. So the first evidence we have of North Atlantic colonies out with Scandinavia is probably in Shetland, the northernmost of the Scottish island groups. And then we have settlement heading south from there to Orkney, the north of Scotland, the Western Isles, down into Ireland, and heading north, going up to the Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, and then over to the coast of North America.
All of that movement required dependable transportation. In Roskilde, Denmark, historians and sailors at the Viking Ship Museum figured out how their Norse ancestors navigated back and forth across the North Atlantic.
Well, sailing a ship like this to Baffin Island from Scandinavia, of course it depends on the weather, but I don't know, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, depending on the weather. If you're a fisherman and you start off the coast of Norway, after a couple of years you will find both the Shetland Islands, you will find the Faroe Islands, and you can see the clouds building over the mountains in the distance from Iceland, and of course you will sort of find, oh, there's something over there, let's go look for it. And bit by bit you will build the experience that after a couple of generations there will be no problem actually by island hopping, sort of finding new ways.
This ship is called the Ottar, after a walrus hunter from the Norse sagas. Danish archaeologists recovered the wreck of the original Ottar from the bottom of this fjord. They took measurements and studied the design and decided to make their own working model.
The boat handles actually quite well. We've had it in some pretty bad weather in the North Sea, and it is like a cargo ship, so it's a bit like comparing a cargo truck with a sports car. We have 16 tons of ballast. I can show you by opening up here that we actually have rocks down here. It's just loose planks as well. And you can see we got 16 tons of rocks down here. So this is actually, knee deep in rocks just to keep us steady in the water. If you don't have this ballast to keep you steady in the water, you will capsize.
It seems that rocks weren't the only things below decks. The ships carried rats as well. How do we know? Because Dr. Sutherland found signs of rats at Nanook, and rats are not indigenous to Baffin Island.
We have rat remains microscopically identified. There are about 4 to 5 fragments of rat pelts. They would simply not have survived in small Dorset dwellings, but in a European dwelling, a larger dwelling, they could certainly hide and have their own little spaces without being noticed. That's what we call proxy evidence for European architecture when we have something like rat remains.
From that building on Baffin Island, the Norse could sail forth and collect timber, minerals, and incredibly valuable goods from along the Canadian coast, south as far as Newfoundland, north to Ellesmere. It gave them an advantage in the European marketplace.
To put things in context, a polar bear hide was a gift for an emperor, and a pair of walrus tusks was an appropriate gift for a king. So that's the value that was put on these things as they moved further south into Europe. And that's why they were such a high status type of thing for a person to be able to trade.
Now, it isn't news that the Norse had visited Canada before John Cabot or Christopher Columbus. In the 1960s, archaeologists uncovered a Norse site in Newfoundland that dated back to the 11th century. Lancel Meadows was an important discovery, the first evidence of the Norse crossing the Atlantic and arriving in Canada. But Lancel Meadows was not a trading post. It was a ship repair station for boats cruising the coast of North America, and it was only used for about a decade.
We have no archaeological evidence whatsoever from Lancel Meadows for contact with the people, the Aboriginal people who were living in that region at the time.
And here's the point that just popped up.
Unlike here at the Nanook site, where native hunting tools come out of the very same earth as European artifacts.
Whoa, this is really nice. In a previous season, we found traces of skins with end scrapers and needles and what we would consider to be women's tools, processing hides, in other words, processing skins.
The evidence at Nanook seems to be saying that the Norse and the Dorset encountered each other on this Baffin Island cape. The Norse likely spent a lot of time here. They would have tread carefully so they could open up lines of trade.
Trade takes on the form of many different kinds of interactions. There's even things called silent trade, where you leave out something that you want the other party to have, but you know you're not quite sure whether it's going to be a positive connection or not. And then you come back 2 weeks later and see if anything is there, and it goes on like that until each party gets what they really want.
Whatever happened here, it wasn't a one-time thing. This site has too many layers, seems to have been used for too many years to have just been a simple, temporary shelter.
The Norse venture to North America was not a flash in the pan. I think we've got good indications now, signals from throughout the Arctic, both from Dorset localities and Inuit localities, that there was a dynamic happening here.
We don't have a deep knowledge about the Dorset. But by examining their relationship with the Norse, Pat Sutherland is hoping she can find a window, peeking into who these mystery people were.
A large concentration of cordage. This seems to be a single strand that's ended up in amongst this.
The only time Pat Sutherland and her crew can do archaeological work up here is during the short Arctic summer. The weather is cool and the days are long. But the mosquitoes are abundant, and they're huge.
Everybody's complaining about it, so they're pretty bad. But yes, today I think we're getting more mosquitoes on this site as opposed to the other one, because the mosquitoes may be breeding in all this water that's still in the site. So they're relatively bad today, I'd say.
The mosquitoes aren't the only thing they have to worry about. The team employs a bear monitor to watch over their every move during the workday at the Nanook site. Dr. Sutherland's camp is electrified to dissuade polar bears from coming in and snooping around. There haven't been any bear sightings this year, but it's important to take every precaution. So when Pat Sutherland decides to venture out past the camp and the dig site, she does so with an armed guard. These walks are important because Arctic archaeology starts with a traverse. That's when the evidence first reveals itself.
When did you locate this? Yesterday?
Yeah, yesterday.
You were coming up to camp.
Good.
Wow, Mo. Okay, that's fantastic. Do you want to take it very carefully out of the position there? Oh, that's a beauty. Let's have a look here. Very nice ground slate point with notching on the base of it, right up on top of this hill. Amazing. Let's get a coordinates on it.
The Dorset have been described as the mystery people of the Arctic. They inexplicably disappeared about 5 centuries ago.
181.
181.
They may have been overwhelmed by the arrival of the Thule, who were a more aggressive, territorial people. But no one is really certain what led to the Dorset demise, and as a result, exactly who they were remains a mystery.
And there are stories about what these people looked like, but the stories vary quite a bit. Sometimes they're described as tiny people, sometimes they're described as giants. There are stories about them, the ancient Inuit, the Thule people, driving the Dorset people away, that they were not aggressive people at all. People today still will repeat and tell you these stories. They still continue on in the oral history of the Inuit. But we have very little archaeological evidence.
Perhaps the best window into the lost Dorset culture exists in their art.
The art gave me a real, I think a better insight into Dorset culture than just looking at the stone tools and the harpoon heads, and probably gave me a more open perspective on the Dorset people and what they might have been doing here and how complex their culture might have really been. This is a Dorset carving of a person in typical Dorset dress. So you see the leggings here, the boots, the double parka. And with the Dorset, in contrast to the Thule people, they seem to have not worn hoods per se, but collars, high collars that stood up. Most of the representations are like that. But the clothing is there. It's skin. It's representing skin clothing, leggings, parka, kamiks or boots. This would have been used in shamanic activities, but you can see the shape of the eyes here, the nose. The teeth are accentuated because often they would wear a set of carved teeth in their mouths to represent an animal. This is a special piece for us because all these antler wands that have multiple faces on them, with the exception of this one, seem to be representations of real people or perhaps ghost-like people. In this instance, we've got the typical Dorset face here, but when you turn the wand in this direction, you see a very different face. A very long, pronounced nose, strong eyebrow line, and what appears to be a beard.
Two very distinctive faces carved into the same piece of antler. The wand could represent two different people existing together.
It's art, so it's up to interpretation, but I think, and this evidence doesn't stand on its own, but taken together with all of the other evidence that we have, I think it's probably speaking to encounters that were recorded in artwork.
Perhaps the Dorset were as open to trade as the Europeans were. At least, that's what the mix of artifacts at Nanook might suggest.
Ooh, it's a nice piece. Yeah, we're getting further samples of cordage, which I've argued is Norse because it was the first piece that was found from North Baffin and analyzed by textile experts in England, was identified as directly comparable to yarn from two textiles from North Greenland.
The earliest sites in Greenland date back to the 10th century. And one of the consistent archaeological markers they find in Greenland is the cordage, made with an ancient European drop spindle technique.
This is a European technology. We've separated it all out now to have it analyzed, to look for presence of knots, to look for direction of spin. It's very consistent. The textile analysts who've looked at this have said these pieces were spun by expert spinners. That's the first piece.
The first piece of cordage ever found in the Arctic was in 1984. It was then stored and forgotten at the Canadian Museum of Civilization in Ottawa, until Dr. Sutherland rediscovered it in the shelves and used it to compare to the cordage she was finding herself.
You can see that it looks like string, really, but the cordage is all made out of wild animal hair, and it's really yarn, spun cordage or yarn that Norse women were spinning. Fragile condition. All of the cordage that we found on Baffin Island is made out of wild animal hair, principally Arctic fox and Arctic hare fur.
The town of Kimmerit is up the coast from the Nanook site. Kimmerit was the site of the very first Hudson's Bay Company post in the eastern Arctic. They set it up here because of the abundance of furs, mainly Arctic fox furs, and a willingness among the local Inuit to do business. Pat Sutherland thinks the scene was similar centuries earlier. The characters may have been different, but the goal was the same. People decided to bridge their unfamiliarity with each other in order to benefit from trade.
This was a nexus. The Arctic 1,000 years ago was as complex and dynamic a place as any other place.
It's still difficult, though, to interpret what this place would have looked like. To get a sense of the structure the Norse built, Pat needs to search for more clues far from here, on the other side of the Atlantic, where the Norse came from. The landscape of the Outer Hebrides isn't that different from Baffin Island. Barren, wind-blown, and beautiful. The Norse lived in the Hebrides for 5 centuries. Explorer and outlaw Leif Erikson was married to a local girl. The place names here still bear Scandinavian origins.
This is sort of one edge of the world, and the other is you're going to the other edge on Baffin Island, but there's a connection. It was connected, and it was connected by means of islands. The whole exercise of moving west was island hopping. Greenland was a small European nation on the fringes of Arctic North America, and the people were going out from there to get resources. This is a chapel, a church, if you will, church chapel, that's believed to date to the 11th century. As you can see, it's quite tumbled down and there's no roof left, but you get a good view of the stonework there. And the Norse were present from 800 AD on, so they may well have used this church.
This is the Isle of Lewis, the outermost of the Hebrides, where the history goes back through millennia. From that tiny broken-down Norse chapel to the massive Iron Age Brochs, down through the ages to the standing stones of Callanish, after Stonehenge, the largest cluster of standing stones in the UK. It dates back 5,000 years.
Well, we do see early sites in Canada too, of course. In the Yukon, probably 18,000 years old, but I think for most people in Canada, that history isn't all that visible to them. Here, it's palpable. I think part of the appeal for me is the environment that we find these sites in, and it has that remoteness, that isolation that you see in the Arctic, where people were living on the edge, but for different reasons.
It was the architecture that first brought Pat Sutherland to the Hebrides. She hoped there would be some clues here that would help her understand what that structure on Baffin Island might have looked like. The modern Hebridean homes bear the brunt of the relentless wind. In the adjacent crofts lay the rocky ruins of old buildings. Some of the ruined walls just look like fences now, or sheep paddocks. But they are in fact the remains of a centuries-old design that dates back to Norse times. For generations, these stone huts were what people lived in, and Pat Sutherland believes that these old buildings, these black houses, might resemble what was built back at the Nanook site on Baffin Island. Dr. Mary MacLeod lives here on the Isle of Lewis. Dr. Sutherland's colleague from Baffin is an expert on the traditional buildings of the North Atlantic.
black house was to describe a phrase that was coined in English to talk about a poor house, a house that was poorly made, badly made. They're not actually poorly made, but the folk who are living here were very, very poverty-stricken. These buildings they're shaped by the local environment and they're shaped by the resources that were available to people, but the actual style of them and the sort of sub-rectangular shape, that goes back to the Viking period. So 1,000 years, 1,200 years we're talking about here.
Some of these black houses were still being lived in as recently as the 1970s. Families resided in one end and livestock in the other, all under one roof. Often, there were no chimneys. The smoke simply ebbed out through the timbers and the thatching.
You can see that the timbers that are required here are not very long, in fact. They're quite short, and they're clustered together. So we are talking on Baffin Island about a definite absence of wood, and in South Baffin, it's not a place where driftwood tends to collect. So the wood would have been brought with them.
The weight of the roof is absorbed by the weight of the walls. The downward thrust of the roof is supported by the weight of the walls underneath it. And the timber that's used in the roof is often, as Pat was saying, very light, and it's generally recycled. So if you look at old roofs, you'll see quite a lot of them have, for example, shipworm holes in the timber, teredo holes, which means that the timber was driftwood that was picked up on the shore. And when folk were not well off, they recycled the timber. You also find that they used whalebone if they could get it. You get whale ribs used in a lot of roofs.
So is this what the structure on Baffin looked like? Not entirely. As Mary McLeod says, buildings like these were made with the materials at hand, and on Baffin, that meant dirt and moss as well as stones. No thatching. But the structural idea was very likely the same, utilized as a trading post.
Well, I think we've got indications of early European architecture at Nanook, so there was some kind of structure there that they were operating out of and living in for short periods of time. There would probably be walrus tusk brought to Nanook that the Norse from Greenland and Iceland would want to take back to Norway and elsewhere.
For the Norse who lived in the Greenland colonies, walrus ivory was one of the most valuable items they could send back to Europe. At the Museum of Scotland, a select few of the Lewis chessmen. National treasures carved from ivory in the 12th century. The faces are Norse, especially the berserker, who plays the rook, his teeth gnawing at his shield, spoiling for a fight. These ivory playing pieces were lost for centuries, only to turn up in 1831, buried in a sand dune on the Isle of Lewis.
It could be ivory that the Dorset people took when they hunted the walrus and passed on to the Norse as part of the trade. So the walrus tusks would have come through the trade network where they would be carved into these pieces, and then the pieces would be part of sets that ended up here but were probably destined for somewhere in Europe or even in the Middle East.
It's incredible to think that an ancient people from the Canadian Arctic could have been part of an international trade network. The famous and historic Vinland map shows the scope of the Norse trading world. They had a working navigable knowledge of Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. But over here, in the Northwest Atlantic, there are only hints of Baffin Island. And it's no wonder. The Norse were striking it rich, and they wouldn't have wanted to let everybody know where they were getting their goods. As Pat Sutherland and Mary McLeod say, the black houses probably provide an analog for what might have been built on Baffin. But there is one feature that is exactly the same.
Well, this is just a drain that's running down. It's an open drain in the floor of the byre, and any water that was moving under the floor of the house would actually come here, and it would help flush out the animal waste towards the end of the house. It's very common, particularly in Norse and later buildings.
It's much easier to see and much more formalized, but we do have a stone made with cobbles, a stone floor drain at Nanook. It begins here at what we think is a small wall going across over to where Mo is working, and it cuts around this piece of degrading bedrock. They avoided it and curved the drain, and it heads up into the other part of the site. I've seen a lot of Dorset sites throughout the Arctic. We've never ever found a drainage feature or a house drain or a floor drain, if you will, in a Dorset structure, nor in an ancient Inuit structure for that matter. So it's outside the range of variability for Dorset architectural features. Drains are common in Norse sites, but they're also common in later European sites too. So it really is almost a signature of European occupation.
But how long ago did that occupation occur? It's turned out that getting radiocarbon dates from Norse finds in the Arctic has been difficult. They are all over the timescale. Radiocarbon dating measures the decay of carbon in artifacts to determine their age. Some of those ages are too early, back to the year 870. That is about 100 years before the Norse had even arrived in Greenland.
Pieces that I thought you might be interested in, that one and this one.
Part of the problem is marine animal fat.
That's burn seal fat.
Okay, you want me to bag that?
Yeah.
In archaeological sites, fat from butchered whales, walruses, and seals can set the radiocarbon dating scale off by centuries.
This is another chunk of seal fat.
That's because of the way carbon is absorbed by organisms in the water, as opposed to organisms on land. The Nanook site is soaked. It's like a soup. The old remains of rendered animal fat have coated everything.
I mean, the artifacts from the Helluland project are suggesting a period between 1250 and 1350. But I think there's going to be when we finish with the unraveling all the problems with the radiocarbon dating, or at least getting further ahead with that, there will be something earlier. We should measure this in, and then I'd like to pick it up and put the pieces together. It's primitive, but it looks like it's been worked along here and here.
So in order to zero in on dates, Pat Sutherland has compared the artifacts found at Nanook with ones found in Greenland and Europe. If the artifacts are similar in material, design, and execution, she can determine the period in which they were made. That gives her a clearer timeline.
I think we can probably talk about the possibility of this area having been utilized over a period of 4 centuries.
Four centuries is a long time. So does that mean the Norse could have actually lived here, at least seasonally? Could this be the first European dwelling on North American soil? To try to figure that out, Dr. Sutherland will need to go deeper into the artifacts than she has ever gone before. This is a scanning electron microscope at the Geological Survey of Canada in Ottawa. Pat Sutherland is using it to analyze the artifacts in intense detail. That is a hone that they are putting into the chamber, a stone tool used for sharpening knives and axes.
This section was excavated in the 1960s. When we went back, we came up with this piece, and where are we here? It's a direct fit. That's Norse. The squared tapered style, you could go to any sites in Scandinavia for the Viking Age and the medieval Norse, and you would find hones just like that. KDDQ9-618 is the sample number. That's from the Nanook site.
Under the microscope, the surface of the Norse hone becomes a geography unto itself, a terrain interrupted at intervals by these blotches, traces of smelted metal.
This is 21 microns.
21 microns?
Yeah.
In the wet and acidic environment, iron tools would rust away and disappear.
Yeah, that's iron oxide there.
Okay.
But tiny traces of metal can still survive. As the microscope traverses the surface, Pat Sutherland asked geologists Pat Hunt and Peter Thompson to tell her if there is any evidence clinging to the hone.
So 1 is the iron oxide, hit number 1, and number 2 is the tin.
Pure tin is not a common constituent of this rock. It's definitely exotic.
The hone is made from stone, probably quarried on Baffin Island or possibly Greenland.
I'd like to get
Neither iron oxide nor tin is part of its constituent qualities. But tin is present in copper alloys, the kinds of alloys people use to make certain kinds of knives and other metal tools. And there's a very good chance the tin got there when someone was sharpening something on the
If
hone.
you can give me a size when it's convenient, Pat. Thank you.
The SEM team prepares to take measurements in microns. Microns are fractions of millimeters. Tiny, but in this hyper-enlarged world, they are huge swaths of evidence for Pat Sutherland.
Looks pretty substantial. 20
Yeah.
or so?
63.
Oh, 60. Oh, my goodness. Okay.
63.2.
The results have been spectacular. We've got meteoric iron, smelted iron. We've got copper alloys. We have something called bismuth, which is often found in metalworking areas. It can be used as a flux if you're working with metals. So, and it's the same as the readings are similar to what we're getting off the hones that actually come out of Norse sites in Greenland. It certainly substantiates that there were Europeans on the site, no question about that, but I think we've got that with the whetstones and all kinds of other evidence.
The evidence is almost overwhelming. The rats, the tools, the Dorset art and hunting points, the spun cordage, the exotic wood, and the hone.
There's lots of bright spots there now.
Add that to the excavations and the traces of architecture, what we know about the Norse black house design. And then consider the walrus ivory and the animal furs, and remember that the Vinland map shows where Helluland is. The story that Pat Sutherland is telling us now is the sum of a series of small, considered, deliberate scientific steps.
Taking all of the different lines of evidence together, it would appear that the early Europeans who were there interacting with the Dorset were on the ground and in place and staying for a certain period of time.
So what did this place look like during the time the Norse and the Dorset were interacting here? No one knows for sure, but here is an idea. A structure similar to those black houses, with a mossy roof and low stone walls, made with materials at hand. It would have been sturdy enough to provide shelter, even over winter if need be. A place where the Norsemen welcomed the Dorset in trade. Pat Sutherland and her colleagues believe the pieces of the Nanook story are coming together.
It's about the discovery, it's about the journey. It's not really about the big eureka moments. It's about the process and just working away at a puzzle. And even if we aren't fitting the pieces entirely together, we're starting to get glimpses of a picture of what was going on there.
Historians and archaeologists have suspected for years that there were Europeans making contact with North Americans long before Columbus or Cabot. Now Pat Sutherland has that body of evidence that shows the Norse were the first, even if they were a little secretive about it at the time.
I think they painted a picture in the accounts and in going home and talking about Helluland, probably as a place that you don't want to go there because trade was controlled by relatively few individuals, chieftains, and they wouldn't want the whole world to know that Helluland was where it was at in terms of trade. I think we've only just begun to delve into what the Norse were doing there, and we've just got the beginning of the story.